This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have Commodore Anil Jai Singh with us today. Once again, of course, he's a submarine veteran and vice president of the Indian Maritime Foundation. Today, we're going to talk to him about something that's been really hogging headlines. What really happened in Bangladesh? We are particularly wanting to talk to Commodore Anil Jai Singh for one particular reason. He understands the critical reason that many are saying the US has been upset with Sheikh Hasina. And that's because Sheikh Hasina deepened the submarine ties and procured submarines from China, and then allowed China to start building the BNS Sheikh Hasina, which is a naval base in Bangladeshi territory, in Bangladeshi waters. Commodore Anil Jai Singh, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Sengupta. It's indeed a pleasure to be on your program once again. Thank you very much.
Let me begin by asking you, take us through why you think this decision of submarine diplomacy, as some have called it, between Bangladesh and China would have raised the hackles of many in the West, including the United States, and certainly got India worried too.
Well, at the outset, submarines are a very aspirational capability for any navy. It adds a lot of credibility. It adds a lot of offensive firepower to any navy. So many small navies aspire to have a submarine force, however big or small it may be. So Bangladesh is the latest addition to that. And the Philippines is looking for submarines. Thailand, of course, has submarines. Sri Lanka at some point in time had expressed an interest in having a submarine arm, because submarines bring a different dimension to naval warfare, which the surface navy doesn't. By the fact that they're stealthy, they can conceal themselves, and in waters like the Bay of Bengal, they're a very effective platform to deny the sea to the enemy, as a sea denial platform. And perhaps in a limited geographical area, even a limited sea control platform. So submarines bring a lot of heft to a navy's power projection capability in a restricted area of operations, which is what Bangladesh is looking at. Bangladesh is not aspiring to be a global blue water navy, but certainly, like any other country, it is very keen to protect its own maritime frontiers, notwithstanding the presence of friendly neighbors like India, who would definitely not let Bangladesh's security get compromised. From the submarine perspective, look, what China gave Bangladesh was 2 Ming-class submarines. Well, China's been making overtures to Bangladesh for a long time. There is other Chinese. This is not the only Chinese equipment in the Bangladesh military. There are other Chinese equipment also in the Bangladesh military. I think they have a couple of ships which were given by China as well. But here was an aspirational capability which China was ready to accommodate. And so there was no reason for Bangladesh not to accept that, particularly since they were already engaging with China. If you remember, a few years ago, even Xi Jinping had visited Bangladesh and offered a very, very generous economic package to Bangladesh. So obviously, China has been wooing Bangladesh for some time, because for China, a foothold in the Bay of Bengal becomes extremely important. And now by giving these 2 submarines, look, Ming-class submarines are old submarines. I think these submarines, they were among the first submarines China built in China in the 70s, 80s, etc. These 2 submarines, I understand, are of about 1990 vintage. So they're already 30, 35 years old. So they're not really, frontline combat platforms in the real sense of the term by sheer age. And 2 submarines are a very sort of basic number for any country to have, which means that even if one submarine is in refit, which it will be, or under maintenance, you only have one submarine left, whose movements can be tracked. You will know when she's at sea with satellite imagery and when she's back in harbor. But I don't think Bangladesh is in a position to, at the moment, look at having a bigger submarine fleet. So what really caused a lot of concern and consternation was the fact that by virtue of giving these 2 submarines, China was able to convince Bangladesh to build a submarine base, the BNS Sheikh Hasina, which you alluded to, which was commissioned in March 2023 by Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Now, this is what should be of great concern to everybody in the neighborhood, not only the US, not only to India, because this base can accommodate up to 6 submarines and 8 ships. Now, for a navy that does not probably aspire to have more than 2 submarines for a long time to come, to go in for a base and make that kind of investment to have for 6 submarines really seems a little incongruous to me at this point of time. I mean, I'm sure they're not thinking so far ahead that 30 years down the line, when we have 6 submarines, then this base will be very useful to us. I'm sure that's not the consideration. So obviously there was a motive for China to do what it did. And China is very good at its military diplomacy because they have the economic heft, they have the military heft in being able to, give a lot of military hardware, export a lot of military hardware at probably what we used to, in the good old Soviet days, called friendship prices, which sort of, make sure that their equipment is purchased by countries in the neighborhood. So I think from that perspective, and this perhaps, if indeed the US is concerned about it, this is one of the reasons, because China now gets a foothold in the Bay of Bengal. We can come to that later as to what is the foothold it gets and how does it how does it affect the security dynamics of the region?
I'll put to you now that the creation of this naval base, as you say, raised, doubts and anxieties in many countries, certainly the Western America that you spoke about, but also in India. And I think this is not being discussed enough. Certainly, eyebrows were raised in India too. And that is because India traditionally has thought of the Bay of Bengal as its backyard, so to speak, if I may use a colloquial phrase. And that is being challenged significantly as the days go by China. Of course, we know what's happening in the, sort of beyond the greater Nicobar Island region. We know what's happening in Southeast Asia. We know, Chinese movements across the waters in this area. And of course, now in Bay of Bengal, which really India for a long time thought of as really its own territory, and at least that one area where it reigns supreme. Now, the creation of this naval base would have raised eyebrows across the board in our establishment too. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, you're absolutely right. The Bay of Bengal has been India's unchallenged sort of maritime, well, I would go to the extent of colloquially calling it probably an Indian lake. We've never been seriously challenged in the Bay of Bengal ever, as the Indian Navy or Indian maritime security concerns. Yes, there have been pinpricks with Bangladesh at various times. All of them have been resolved very amicably, whether it was, whatever they may have been. We've never had really major issues or any direct challenge to our predominant position in the Bay of Bengal. Now, that position in the Bay of Bengal stands seriously challenged because China, when it moves westward into the Indian Ocean, is not going to be content with just allowing itself sticking to the central Indian Ocean, because it looks at the Eastern Indian Ocean or the Southeastern Indian Ocean as a vulnerability. So it definitely wants a foothold in these waters. And if they can also, that gives them a foothold in the Bay of Bengal, all the better. Because India now will not be able to operate unchallenged. Whenever China has the kind of power projection capability to deploy itself, to deploy ships permanently in the Indian Ocean region. China has already engaged very, very strongly with Myanmar, militarily very engaged. We have sort of misread Myanmar a bit, if I may say so, because I don't think we expected the junta to come back when it did. We probably didn't anticipate the coup. We engaged very heavily with Myanmar to the extent of giving them one of our own operational submarines, INS Sindhu Veer, on some sort of a lease arrangement. Now, submarines are the highest end of military hardware. So if you're really willing to give a submarine to another country, it means your level of diplomatic and military engagement with that country is very deep and very intense, or you're looking to make it very deep and very intense. Now, that move backfired, in my opinion, because, once it was sort of decided that there will be a submarine transfer to Myanmar, a few months after that, the Chief of Army Staff, General Naravane, accompanied by the Foreign Secretary, visited Myanmar. And General Naravane, by the way, has been a former defense attaché to Myanmar. And 3 months after that visit, we gave them the submarine, INS Sindhu Veer, on their Navy Day in December, I think 2020 it was, if I'm not mistaken. So, having given that submarine, 2 months later, there was a coup in Myanmar. So obviously, we read the situation very wrong. Either we thought that perhaps if something like this also were to happen, we accounted for that eventuality, that something like this could happen in Myanmar, but we'll engage with the junta, which India has never really actively engaged with the junta. We have to a certain extent, because we can't isolate Myanmar totally, politically or otherwise. But I think we got it wrong, because on its very next Navy Day in 2021, Myanmar accepted a Ming-class submarine from China. So now the Chinese have a foothold in Myanmar. They have Myanmar Navy has a Chinese submarine, and it also has an Indian submarine, which obviously the Chinese would know more about now since it is operating in Myanmar. So I don't think that was a very wise thing that happened, or rather that was an unfortunate thing that happened, or the coup happening, etc. So it was all the more important that we must be able to secure at least the Bay of Bengal insofar as Bangladesh is concerned. And with Sheikh Hasina being at the helm, it's the best relations India can ever have. I don't think India can have that sort of engagement with Bangladesh as we had with Sheikh Hasina when she was in power. And I'm not even sure that if Sheikh Hasina is no longer an equation in the country's politics and the Awami League were to come back to power, would we still have that sort of closeness with Bangladesh? Because that closeness was very, very, very closely related to the fact that Sheikh Hasina was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's daughter. And that was the sort of relationship which was benefiting us to a certain extent and enabling us to engage so closely with Bangladesh. So I think that is an important factor. Now for India, what does this mean? It means that China can now access the Indian Ocean and perhaps use these base facilities. Now, I raised this issue at some debate on the subject, and I was told by very authoritative sources there that, look, there are certain red lines Bangladesh will never cross. So we don't really have to worry about this. They're not going to, if tomorrow we were to enter into confrontation with China or a very tenuous situation was developing, Bangladesh is not going to actively support the Chinese efforts to base ships and all in Sheikh Hasina. I'm not so sure about that. And it's not about conflict. It's about the general maritime presence and domination of a particular area, which is what China is trying to do. You see, if China has to enter the Indian Ocean and become a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, which it requires if it has to become a global maritime power, because the Indian Ocean gives it the sea space to project its power. And it also gives it access to the Atlantic. It has to mitigate its vulnerability to what is called its Malacca dilemma. This Malacca dilemma fundamentally is that India is sitting astride the approaches to the Malacca Straits from where a majority of China's trade and energy flows. So China is apprehensive about the fact that India could perhaps, to some extent, choke Chinese trade if push comes to shove. To mitigate that, they need a naval presence close to the Andaman Nicobar Islands. They need a presence in the Bay of Bengal to contain India's sort of unchallenged supremacy over there. So all these factors have led China to engage more heavily in the Bay of Bengal and ensure that they have created capabilities which enable them to have a permanent presence here as and when they choose. Now, why specifically submarines? That I could come to later if you.
We'll come to that in just a moment. Sir, I want to ask you one question. Allow me to play devil's advocate and say this. Of course, you believe and I believe and many in the Indian establishment believe that we would never have a friend like Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. Now, my question then arises, if we had such great ties and such a close friendship with Bangladesh, could you speculate on why Sheikh Hasina would go ahead and allow the Chinese to build a naval bay in her waters, in her territory?
I think, firstly, Sheikh Hasina played her cards, I think, quite smartly. She was engaging with China as much as probably she was engaging with India. And India had no reason to tell her not to do that, perhaps. It's an independent country. She is fully at liberty. And Bangladesh doesn't consider itself some small little, enclave of India's. It's a sovereign country with very clear sovereign interests. And if those sovereign interests included engaging with China, well, so be it. Maybe India could have given them submarine, but India does not have the military capacity or capability right now to be able to export or gift high-end military platforms to anybody. I mean, we've given one to Myanmar, but that's at the cost of our own submarine fleet, which is already stressed with old submarines. So that was a major decision taken. So perhaps we were not in a position to do what China has done. And China, I think, looks at this whole region very differently. Their approach is different. I think their military diplomacy is very, very, very effective. They've been able to look what, you remember that old talk of string of pearls strategy.
Of course. And then it was said that India was countering with a necklace of diamonds, but I don't know how far we were able to build that necklace.
Our approach is somewhat different. Since we can't match China's economic heft or military heft, we have to find other means of establishing our sort of influence in the region through capacity building, through, more benign means, HADR efforts, search and rescue exercises, coastal security support. There are other areas. We cannot play in the same league as China in terms of naval hardware, because they can just keep they're churning out ships at the rate of 20, 25 a year, which no country since World War II has been able to do, and is still, even some countries like the US cannot match that. So that's a different equation. So we are also doing our bit, not in the sense, but our approach is different. Bangladesh, we never thought we probably didn't anticipate something like this would happen. And so I don't think we really feared that with this Chinese engagement, India was directly threatened. Yes, a Chinese presence in the Bay of Bengal, but had it not been Bangladesh, they would have continued to engage with Myanmar, and it was inevitable. Somewhere, in some manner or the other, China would definitely enter the Bay of Bengal, and that is perhaps also the reason why the US has wanted to enter the Bay of Bengal, because in their larger Great Power contestation, they didn't want to leave any ocean area, unmarked from where China is present. So that could be one of the reasons why US was interested in this region. Otherwise, really speaking, if Bay of Bengal is a so-called Indian lake, and India has got such a deep strategic, military strategic relationship with the US, why would the US want to come into the Bay of Bengal, and that too on a tiny island right inland in the Bay of Bengal? I mean, India is there. India has good relations with Bangladesh. So obviously there is more to it than meets the eye in terms of the larger geopolitical contestation that is going to happen in this region. Now, from a submarine perspective, why a submarine base? China is deeply constrained in its ability to operate submarines in the Indian Ocean. It has all the three choke points leading to the Indian Ocean, whether it's Malacca, Lombok, or Sunda, are not conducive for submarines to transit dive by the sheer depths of water not being enough, or certain physical features which don't permit safe and easy dive submarine operations. Therefore, any submarine entering the Indian Ocean from China could be tracked by India, because it will have to come on surface through these straits. Now, once it enters the Indian Ocean, India could continue tracking it, because it knows exactly when the submarine has come in and which direction it's headed in. No matter, it is not easy to track. Looking for a submarine in a vast expanse of the Indian Ocean is like looking for a needle in a haystack, literally. But the fact is, we would still know that there's a submarine here, or generally where it could go. What happened? That was one part. The second aspect is that the Indian mainland or Indian Ocean is 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers away from the mainland of China. Now, unless you have adequate number of nuclear submarines where endurance is not an issue, if you have to deploy conventional submarines, they are severely constrained by the fact that their transit itself to and from China is 12,000 kilometers, 12 to 14,000 kilometers. If they come into the Bay of Bengal, it's even more. It's almost 15,000 kilometers. Now, if you take away 15,000 kilometers from a conventional submarine's endurance, it's not really left with very much what we call time on task, because she's expended a lot of effort in coming and going, and also has probably been tracked because she's entered on surface. This was a major constraint as far as China's maritime aspirations or naval aspirations in the Indian Ocean go. By creating a submarine base built by China, equipped by China, meant for submarines gifted by China, which means that China has already created or will help create support facilities for these Ming submarines, which also will be able to provide support to Chinese conventional submarines that come into the Bay of Bengal. So now you have a submarine that does the 6,000 kilometers and enters Bay as Sheikh Hasina, berths over there, undergoes a logistic replenishment, whatever little maintenance, support, repair, etc. And then if it deploys from there, how do we know? We won't know where it is in the Bay of Bengal, because we won't be able to track it from the time it leaves harbor. Unlike, tracking it all the way from the Chinese mainland because of the shallow waters. So these are the constraints, or these are the concerns India has, that if Chinese submarines can come and start operating in the Bay of Bengal, it can certainly constrain our freedom of operation in those waters, which is something India can ill afford. We are making huge investments in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. We've heard about the Great Nicobar project of ports and marinas and marine tourism and economic development. These were presumed on the fact that the Bay of Bengal will probably not be challenged there. And we can therefore create this kind of infrastructure. Now, if we create that sort of infrastructure, we also have to ensure that we can secure that infrastructure. Besides that, the presence of Chinese Navy in the Bay of Bengal mitigates the Malacca dilemma to quite an extent, because now they can operate around the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, in the Andaman Sea, and in the 6 and 9 degree channels, and monitor what is happening, and also secure their own shipping lanes and their shipping. So I think it has implications. While yes, it may be possible that Bangladesh should have certain red lines that if it comes to a conflict situation, they will not give overt support to the Chinese Navy by letting them use the base. But the fact is, we're not talking of war all the time. We're talking of gray zone. We're talking of diplomacy. We're talking of economic coercion. We're talking of gunboat diplomacy. We're talking of many things short of war. all of where we are now going to be somewhat constrained if the Chinese were to have a major naval presence in the Bay of Bengal.
Let's talk a little bit about also Sheikh Hasina's last allegation, where she says that the Americans wanted St. Martin Island from her and to build some sort of a base, which the Americans, of course, have vehemently denied, including pointing out that, you know, this island doesn't have the required facilities. It doesn't have a deep sea port. It doesn't have lots of things. You know, and therefore it won't be very useful. But Sheikh Hasina seemed to have insisted that they wanted this region, wanted this island to build facilities that would counter the Chinese base. How do you see this? Do you think
Well,
this is plausible?
firstly, of course, we're not sure of what exactly the Americans, what they engineered, whether they engineered a regime change or not is open to speculation. Yes, Sheikh Hasina has alluded to the fact that the white man, said she would be allowed to continue in power if St. Martin's Island would be available. And I think the previous BNP government had also been approached at some point of time regarding this. Now, if you see St. Martin's Island, it's just a speck in the Bay of Bengal. It's barely, I think, little over 3 miles long, 7 kilometers long, or something like that. That's the total extent of the island. But it's got a pretty strategic location. It's located, I think, north or southeast of Bangladesh, but between Bangladesh and Myanmar. So it gives quite a vantage position for, shipping coming and going from Cox's Bazar, as well as monitoring what's happening in Myanmarese waters. So if you look at it, absolutely threadbare with no other consideration. Yes, the US would be keen to know what China is doing in the Bay of Bengal. Because when this great power contestation happens, they're not going to leave any waters unpatrolled or allow the Chinese, free reign anywhere. So obviously, there could be a reason for America wanting St. Martin's Island. But if you look at St. Martin's Island, it's a coral island. It's surrounded by coral reefs. So obviously, depths of water are not adequate right there. So they obviously can't set up a deep water port, but they're not looking to set up a port. They're looking to set up some sort of a staging facility, perhaps, for their ships, not even a naval base. Because 3 kilometers or 3 mile long base is not going to give them, 3 mile long island is not going to give them enough room for a full-fledged base. They may want to make a landing strip there to stage the aircraft through. So we don't know what exactly, if they were really so keen on St. Martin's Island that they went to the extent of effecting a regime change to ensure that they get hold of it. Well, obviously, America then has strategic interests in the Bay of Bengal. And that also, if you ask me honestly, it does not augur well for India. Because we do not want this great power contestation happening so close to our waters. In fact, India should ensure and make sure that the world knows that we are capable, or we have the capabilities and the capacities to shape or influence the outcomes in the region around our interest, of our maritime interest. And I think the Bay of Bengal is our absolute, as you mentioned, strategic backyard. So there's no way that we can compromise on securing the Bay of Bengal as an Indian lake, if you call it. So I think it has, if indeed the Americans are keen on St. Martin's Island, if indeed they want to counter, the Chinese movements or monitor the Chinese movements, see what happened in Ukraine-Russia war. That little snake island, which is pretty much similar to this in terms of size, caused enough botheration to the Russian Navy, to the Black Sea Fleet, which, with their missile battery there or whatever little elementary armament they could put there. So these islands have strategic significance depending on where they are. The size doesn't really matter because the size only determine what is the extent of presence they want to have there. I don't think Americans are going to set up a base or a port. They just want a facility where they can maybe set up surveillance stations just to monitor movements of PLA Navy vessels in the area. So we don't know what exactly it wants. We don't even know whether America really wants St. Martin's Island. It's all, people in the corridors of power will probably know the real dynamics. But you and I only know what the media tells us. But yes, America could have an interest in this. The extent of that interest, what is America's ultimate aim? Does America really, to effect a regime change is pretty serious stuff. If somebody's not giving you some sovereign area. So I would reserve comment on this at this point of time as to what America's intentions could be. But certainly, yes, I do believe that they would not like to leave the Chinese unchecked in any theater of possible operations in the future.
I think made some very valuable comments about countering this entire idea that, well, St. Martin's Island is small, it doesn't have a deep sea facility, it's not adequate enough. I think this comparison you made with Snake Island is very important because, even small spaces can have strategic uses which far outweigh, in a sense, what one could understand initially of their use. And of course, the point about surveillance station is very, very useful. One doesn't always have to create a naval base. Of course, surveillance stations itself would be very, very useful for China. Let's talk a little bit as we wrap up this conversation, sir, about what happens next, according to you. India, of course, is very determinedly building, major facilities in the Greater Nicobar Islands, as I of course know. What happens next from India's perspective? What happens next from Bangladesh's perspective? And of course, what happens next from America's perspective?
I think from an Indian perspective, it is very important for us to continue our engagement with Bangladesh. Political, alignments aside, or political partnerships aside, or political relationships aside, we cannot afford to isolate Bangladesh or sort of antagonize Bangladesh to a point where it veers away from us. Bangladesh also realizes this. I'm sure Bangladesh knows that its destiny lies in the Bay of Bengal, and it has to engage with India if it has to be a part of any consequence, even in this region. India has done a lot of capacity building effort in Bangladesh. If you look at BIMSTEC is very Bangladesh centric in a way because it's giving connectivity to landlocked countries through Bangladesh to the Bay of Bengal. India is engaging in these multimodal transport corridors. India is encouraging coastal shipping from Bangladesh. India is including Bangladesh in its coastal radar network, so enhancing Bangladesh's own coastal security capability. So we are already very well engaged and very deeply engaged in Bangladesh. And we look at Bangladesh as part of our larger sort of neighborhood policy. And we are very keen to engage with our neighbors. Our neighborhood first policy is all about that. Sheikh Hasina was the first head of government to visit India after the swearing in of Prime Minister Modi for his third term in office. So these are all factors that cannot be wished away, notwithstanding whoever may be in power. Yes, there will be tensions. Every small country tries to assert its own sort of its own will or its own way to establish that, look, don't trifle with me. I may be small, but I am not going to, buckle into your pressures. So that is always, the resistance is always there. But we have to break it down slowly. We have to assure the new dispensation that we are not, it's not you we are concerned about. It's about the country and the region. And I think any government, when parties are in opposition, their rhetoric is very different from when they come to power. We've seen what's happening in the Maldives. From that very sort of vituperative India out campaign and withdraw your military and all that. Well, President Muzu is singing a totally different tune now. So countries in India's immediate maritime neighborhood understand the value of engaging with India. Who's going to provide that sort of security in the Bay of Bengal? Only India can provide it. And India is not going to provide maritime security for India in the Bay of Bengal. It's going to provide maritime security for the entire Bay of Bengal region. That is very important. That is one part of it. So Bangladesh and India will need to engage with each other, whatever be the tension and the dynamics of that and how they go about it. So that cannot be ignored. We also have to ensure that, we do not sort of isolate the Awami League relationship to a certain extent by sort of making it an us versus them equation. And I think from an American perspective, rather than try and establish their own capabilities in this region, I think they would do well to engage with India. There were differences, if you remember, before the Bangladeshi election, India was supporting Sheikh Hasina and America was, sort of criticizing her human rights record and democracy record, etc., which America has a tendency to do with most countries in the global South. But I think America, if you ask me, should rather leave this region to India and engage with India to ensure that the American interests are protected in this region, rather than try and muscle in on a region which will just add to the overall tension of the area. From the Great Nicobar Island perspective, I think it's important. We have not really exploited the potential of the Andaman Nicobar Islands in many ways. For many, many years, we've been hearing that Port Blair will be made a duty-free trade zone, like Singapore. Something will come up in the Great Nicobar Island. We'll encourage marine tourism. we'll make cruise ship marinas, etc. But nothing really happened because I think the ecological balance there has to be very carefully examined and understood. It's a very, very delicate marine biosphere there. And I'm, any amount, any infrastructure development there, particularly which involves either the coastal zone or the sea in its immediate proximity, is going to cause a lot of environmental damage. And given the issues of climate change that we are tackling on a daily basis and where it's headed, I think this is one area which cannot be totally compromised in the name of development. So you have to strike a very fine balance between the two, which I hope is being done. I don't think anyone is contesting the fact that the Great Nicobar facility or the Nicobar Island facility should not come up. I think what they're contesting is, how are you going about it? Are you going about it the right way? It's very important for India to be more engaged with that region. We have to create infrastructure there. We have to create capabilities there, because once you create a port, once you create other facilities, you will also secure them. So there will be a naval presence, and it sends a message to the world that, look, we are here now. And for us, that's important because we straddle those very important sea lanes. The third thing which is important, and I think this merits mention, particularly when you're looking at the security of that region, is that India so far did not have any transshipment ports because we did not have deep water ports. Most of our 40 to 50% of our transshipment traffic either went to Dubai, Singapore, or Colombo. With Vizhinjam port coming up and on the west coast, and the Vadhavan port coming up, and this Nicobar facility, we are trying to create transshipment facilities in our waters, in Indian territory, which is not only going to benefit Indian shipping, because now we won't have to spend a lot of money and effort going to foreign ports. We'll have our own transshipment ports for our own trade, from where coastal shipping can then take over. But we will also be able to provide this to other countries. So we'll become transshipment hubs for other countries in the region, which adds to a maritime heft in the region. As a maritime power, India still has to develop its non-naval maritime capability. All this is aimed towards achieving that. So I think from that perspective, the Nicobar facility is very important. We just have to strike a fine balance between the environmental concerns and the developmental imperatives.
That's a very neat and a very astute summation of what all of this means for India, America, and of course for Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Commodore Anil Jai Singh, for explaining all of this in such detail to us. Of course, we'll all be looking very closely at what happens next in Bangladesh, where there's an interim government of sorts headed by Dr. Mohammed Yunus, which has taken charge. We will be looking carefully to see what steps they take in this direction. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate your time, sir.
Dr. Sengupta, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Thank you very much.